I've been working with Able for practically 20 years in various bits of the digital space, and we come at issues around BIM in slightly different ways, and actually the way we've ended up in our industry reflects that. As Able says, I'm a partner with Arcadis. I'm also a member of the Construction Leadership Council. So my concern in many ways is around moving the entire industry forward and reflecting the complexity of that industry as well as the leading edge. So if I reflect on some of the amazing stuff that Able's been doing in collaborative global BIM over the last 2 or 3 years, that contrasts quite a bit of my experience on the Construction Leadership Council of an industry that really struggles to understand firstly some of the challenges it faces around actually the fact that it does need to improve its performance, and then how it struggles with its own sort of behaviours and structure to drive that change forward. And in this, what I hope is a very brief presentation, I just want to focus on 3 things. I just want to think about firstly the opportunities that construction represents for blockchain. I think it's always important to focus first on opportunity. And then, of course, it's then very important to be realistic about that opportunity. So then I think about challenges. And then finally, I want to think about priority, because the danger in a field as rich as construction and as rich actually as just articulated in the last presentation in blockchain is that you try and do everything. And rather than do everything, I'd suggest that we try and do 1 or 2 things. Now, if I think about what I've been doing in BIM over the last 15 years or so, I've always tried to focus on the why rather than the how. And again, that sense of why are we doing blockchain and why might we do it is particularly important for me. So what I first really want to think about is opportunities around user requirements. Why is this going to help people in the industry to deliver better outcomes to clients? And when we say better outcomes, we mean more houses, we mean improved journeys through better rail travel, we mean more skilled people because we have better and more effectively delivered schools. That's what it means about that. And so I've got 3 things that I draw up there, and I think they're not unique to construction, but it's always worthwhile stepping back a bit and thinking, well, why is construction particularly worth on this one? So here's this one, transaction-rich environment. Now that is actually a blessing and a curse. That means on each unique project, as Daria outlined a little bit earlier, there are literally thousands and thousands and thousands of individual transactions, which might mean signing off that a piece of information was exchanged from one organisation to another. It might mean that a piece of work was done properly. It might mean that something was paid. Now, that stuff might happen for years and years, and nobody really cares. And then something like Grenfell happens, for example, and suddenly people are thinking, well, was that piece of installation properly fitted? Who did it? And that's where that opportunity around transaction-rich environment comes from. But of course, if you have to pay to capture all of that information, that creates a massive load around the cost of doing that. So blockchain's opportunity, if it can achieve that, is to drive down the cost of capturing that information. The next one is around latency. Now, usually when we talk about latency, it's the idea of, say, for example, flash transactions in financial services, that one bank can beat another bank by a microsecond to get a better deal in a sales transaction. In construction, we're talking about taking hours, days, hundreds of pounds potentially out of individual transactions. So the idea of a transaction in Unilever costs $4, that's a bargain compared to the kind of stuff which we still do in an industry, which is overwhelmingly manual. So again, massive opportunity, but as it said, huge transformation required because behaviourally, we're in an industry which is happy to do things the way we are. And finally, this one around value in date stamp. It sounds simple, but that's probably the most important thing that our industry is going to need going forward. So the golden thread coming out of Dame Judith Hackett's recommendation is all about knowing what was done, when, by who, and how. So the idea that you have an immutable record of when something was done, or more likely when a record of something was captured, is really important. So that's great. That's a fantastic prospectus for why we would do this. Now, the only risk about that is one can also come across as being a snake oil salesman. So the next bit then is, well, what are the challenges that might make that difficult? And some of them I think are quite self-evident. But the most interesting one for me, and it's something actually the industry celebrates, is this idea of absence of process. And I think that most blockchain applications, and for example, the one around container transport, is based on a universally agreed process. This is how we do things. So when we put in a payment from one bank to another, everybody knows how it does. Famously, in construction, when you start construction, a contract goes in the filing cabinet, and you hope it never comes out again. Now that sounds a good thing because everybody's being collaborative and flexible, but actually it means that we make it up as we go along and we're flexible and we do things. So that culturally is something that is really difficult for us, and it means it's very difficult to replicate. Enormously difficult to code a contract when you don't know what somebody's going to do when something happens. The second one is actually the industry really likes that. It likes gaming. We're an industry that likes the deal. So people like to do over somebody else, or they like to get advantage. So the more ambiguous they can position a contract, the specification, actually they'll say that's a positive thing. So changing that behavior to something that's saying that absolute transparency is of value is not just a statement of fact, it's a challenge to an industry culture, and a challenge to a culture where how industry has made money. Now, rather interestingly, there's now that large contractors have to publish their payment behavior. And one contractor I won't name has a very high score, but then if you dig the next level down, you'll find that something like 90% of the payments that they process, they challenge. So the whole business model is around, again, using ambiguity of commercial arrangements to generate profit for their business. How can you apply blockchain to that? And then the final one, without going into too much detail, is the number of stakeholders. Typically, based on some work which I did for Bays a few years ago, you'd find on a 30 million, 40 million pound contract, maybe 70 or 80 first-tier stakeholders. If you go the next level down, say for a £3 million contract, you might find another 100 stakeholders. And each of those are people then employ self-employed organisations, people they never work with. How do they train them? How do they get those people involved? So finding something that's simple, transparent, that people want to use, as simple as a smartphone, has to be the future for blockchain in construction. So my recommendation then is you have to follow a pattern around almost thinking about where the cost sits and where the benefits are. So it's a really simple relationship there as the transactions get more complicated, the costs of processing them grow. And that also then starts to mean that you need to think about focusing on simplicity rather than complexity. So you'll see there, at sort of top right as you're sort of looking at them, information transmission. Just the fact that something happened is probably the highest value because it's the most regular, simple transaction. You go to try and put in a contract in place or process a payment for reflecting change, that gets expensive, it gets complicated. Is it worth it? I will leave that to the organisations that are trying to move it forward. So with the piece of work we've done for World Economic Forum, we start to encourage people to think about simple transactions as the basis for that transformation. Doesn't mean you can't change in the industry, but do it simply to start off with. So some examples there. If you're doing design, rather than trying to do something really complicated like validating the design of a bridge, record the fact that BIM objects have been used and enable that to be modified. If you're thinking about acceptance of work, rather than trying to test and commission an entire building services system, think about recording the fact that it was compliant and think about what we might do with that. So that sense of those potential types of work, recording performance data, not managing a complex payment, is the way to go forward, in my point of view, at this very early stage. And that, in truth, reflects the evolution of BIM from something really simple 20 years ago, something really exciting and transformational now. So in wrapping up, I'm suggesting that we might want to prioritize, put our effort into a small number of baskets rather than the first one. The first one is to believe there is genuine value in the distributed ledger, but also to reflect that the distributed ledger is a quite expensive thing, particularly unpermissioned blockchain. So use that carefully. So you could say that every time you put something into that distributed ledger, make sure it has thousands of pounds of value against it rather than 1p. The second one is to acknowledge that the industry is full of blockers. And some of those blockers are cultural, and some of those blockers are simply the physical reflection of what we do. And so, to some extent, working with those blockers, again, is an important thing. And I'll go back to that use case around the Hackett report and Grenfell, because that is a report that takes on the fragmented nature of the industry head on. It acknowledges the fact that actually organisations take advantage of the fact that people don't necessarily want to know what people have done, and it highlights transparency as something which everybody needs. So use that almost as a laser to cut through the blockers that we know in the industry. And finally, it's just thinking about which environments are the ones that have the most targets in them. So again, those massively repeated, automated, existing use cases where this can we go. So where, for example, you can start to integrate blockchain into BIM, into contractual information exchanges, is a really great place because there's already a process and structure in place. But don't go to the places where that ambiguity already exists. So some really simple principles there. Focus firstly on the opportunities around where there's a vast potential, some volume of work that can be done. Be realistic about the industry, understand its blockers, and then particularly focus on where this value can be added through the specific characteristics of blockchain. Thank you.